So the overall theme for week 2 of this summer class is science and scientific research. So one of the things you're asked to do this week is to read through the course notes for week 2. Those are the notes that address all of the learning outcomes sort of defined for week 2, and they all focus on the ideas or the constructs of science and scientific research. And some of the information and examples presented are going to be foundational for what follows in this class. So I want to spend just a few minutes summarizing, kind of overall summarizing the notes that are presented for week 2. So the first thing that I want to just briefly touch on is the very first objective for week 2 has to do with differentiating between research and evaluation. So overall, the fundamental difference between research and evaluation is purpose. What is the purpose for conducting some kind of a formal, or in some cases an informal sort of investigation or study on something related to your practice. For example, in evaluation, one really common sort of process teachers and administrators go through for evaluation is, well, what impact or what effect do my choices as a teacher have on my students? So that's an evaluation perspective. You're trying to evaluate or judge some decision that you make, or decisions as a teacher, on something that is of value to you, and that is your students. So what impact do your choices make? Research has a different purpose, even though you might go about sort of conducting an investigation in the same way as an evaluation. The purpose of research is to ask the question, well, what impact do the choices that I make as an educator have on variables of interest in education in general? What impact do my choices have on teaching and learning in general? Or in what way do my choices contribute to a better understanding of teaching and learning in general? So it has to do with purpose, and so the notes go over that in some detail. Now, following that is a presentation on different approaches to research, different sort of philosophical approaches or research paradigms. And the two fundamental different approaches that are presented are positivist research approaches and interpretivist research approaches. And I'll just summarize kind of the fundamental difference there by suggesting that in a positivist paradigm, there is a belief or an understanding that some choices teachers make in their practice would be objectively more effective than others. And so although there are many other types of sort of ways to frame positivism, that's just a really good common example from a teaching and learning perspective. So that there are objectively better ways to do things, more effective ways to do things. Interpretivist is different because it puts the emphasis on the experience of the people being studied. So interpretivism is a different way of looking at effectiveness or effects when conducting any kind of an investigation in the classroom would be, well, what effect do my teaching choices have on the experiences that my students have in the classroom? Or what are the experiences my students have based on my actions and my choices as a teacher? So it puts the emphasis on in this case, the primary stakeholder, which would be the students. What is their experience? Trying to map out their experience. And in that approach, there is no objective good experience. Every student would have likely would have a different experience, would have a different reality in the classroom. And so that's just one way to sort of characterize a difference in approaches. And certainly both of those different approaches have their values and can contribute to broad and deeper understandings of teaching and learning in general. But they are very different approaches. And I'll give you just a really quick example in my own life. When I look back as a student, both in elementary school and high school and college, what I find really fascinating is that the classes that had the biggest impact on me, generally speaking, did not follow or a design or an implementation that would be considered the most effective approach objectively. And I've studied approaches to teaching and learning in a lot of different scenarios and contexts as a professional educator. And but it's interesting that the biggest impact on me were different. Were experiences that wouldn't be labeled that way. For example, I had a learning theory class as a graduate student in which the professor just came in, never wrote anything on the board, told these fascinating and compelling stories. And as he was telling these stories, I was really busy trying to, first of all, listen and was enthralled, and then also trying to organize the important pieces of information to help me get a handle on the people and the research and the general theoretical approaches that were being discussed within these stories. He was just such a great storyteller. And there's nothing sort of that would speak to how effective that approach would have based on more of a positivist view on studying the best way to help people learn specific things, but it had a profound impact on me, and I think I learned quite a bit as a result. I also had an anatomy and physiology class in high school that was, that again, when I look back on it, it was lecture-based. I spent a good amount of time copying diagrams off the board. Didn't have a tremendous amount of practice and feedback that the teacher structured within the class. I had copious amounts of notes, and I listened to these very compelling stories. So it was not a very interactive class at all. We did a lot of lab work, but it didn't align so much with the kinds of things that we were expected to demonstrate on an exam. But I loved every second of it, and so that experience for me was really profound. Even though, again, if I were to read through the potential effectiveness of that kind of a model of teaching, I would suggest that it wouldn't be very effective for anybody. But that was my experience. Following a little bit of discussion about research, the notes present some important sort of conceptual information about the scientific method. And I guess the one thing I want to say about that is there is no the scientific method. There are scientific methods, and there are common elements in all models of the scientific method. Whether you're talking about a positivist model or one that would help better understand an interpretivist research paradigm, there are some commonalities, and by far the most common element in any method of science is our observations. Observations are foundational to all scientific methods, and so it's really pay attention to that when you are reviewing the information about steps in a scientific method. Something that's listed in most scientific methods are things like hypotheses and experiment. and variable types. And all I'll say about hypothesis testing is that it's foundational to positivist research approaches. It's testing hypotheses, and yet hypothesis testing is not really any part of an interpretivist approach. Interpretivism focuses heavily on making observations without bringing too many predisposed ideas about what is to be examined, and then making sense of those observations. Whereas in a positivist approach or a positivist scientific method model, it would be more making a lot of observations, identifying patterns, also part of an interpretivist model, identifying patterns, and then questioning why those patterns exist, and making more observations and identifying problems based on that, like why does this exist? Making more observations, doing some literature review of other related research, and then formulating a hypothesis about why you think what you think the answer to a problem might be. And so testing a hypothesis in a positivist scientific method model is really foundational. So just look at those different approaches and make sense of that as best you can. I do want to say something about the scientific method before I go over the parts of the notes that have to do with research as a scientific method, and that is the very first reflection that you were asked to do was to look at some information about a problem that has been identified based on observations, and the problem being, it looks as if student achievement, at least in the United States, has been steadily declining over the last, we could say, 20 years or so. And a number of people, researchers and otherwise, have identified, obviously, possible reasons for it, because that's what you do. You make observations, and then you identify problem, which is does achievement appear to be going down? What are all the possible reasons why? And the use of technology has been identified as a variable that may not be causing a decline, but may be correlated with the decline in some way. And so I asked you to kind of consider that. What kinds of statements can be made about those observations? And so I thought that was a really good way to kind of begin this whole experience about research in education, because it's a very real problem that's been identified, and very real variables that may or may not have anything to do with each other. Certainly requires more study. So the next part of the course notes have to do with research as a scientific method, and one of the first things that's presented are the different types of variables, because variables are things that are kind of the pieces that research are made of. And you're presented with independent, dependent, extraneous, and moderator variables. And one of the things that I asked you to do in the reflection number 4 for week 1 was to identify any variables of interest to you that are related to education and your practice. So I haven't had a chance to review those yet at the time of this taping, but I'm anxious to identify what kinds of variables do students in your situation and teachers in your situation right now, what do you find valuable in that way? So there are variables, and then there are constructs, and constructs represent theoretical ideas of things, whereas variables are the measurable representation of those ideas. And the reason why we focus on constructs in week 2 is because many of the variables of interest that that you likely have and that I have and that researchers in education have in general, the variables are actually operationalized constructs. And I'll say just a little more about that. So when you operationalize something, you're describing it based on how you can tell it exists. You're taking something that's a construct which is not in itself something you could directly observe. You can only infer it exists based on some important ways you decide you're going to measure it. And one of the examples that I had in this class is scientific reasoning. That one of the reflections that I asked you to do, reflection number 3, was to look at how some researchers operationalize scientific reasoning. And in what they did is develop a test to measure that construct, scientific reasoning. And of course, it's very debatable as to whether or not that test itself is a good measure of scientific reasoning. There are things you can do to help kind of maximize the how valid a measure like that might be. One of the most important is to correlate the performance on that test with other measures that you might agree are indicative of scientific reasoning or scientific thinking. But scientific thinking in and of itself is just an abstraction. And so how do we know it exists? Well, that test that I had you look at was just one way. I really like it, though, for a lot of reasons as a teacher, because I haven't seen in my life a lot of examples of paired multiple choice items. And I think that I'm pretty fascinated by that type of assessment. So I thought you would find that interesting. And as we progress in this class, just recognize that many areas of research that you'll either be reading about or that you are interested in yourself really do represent variables that define constructs. Things like achievement is certainly a construct. Intelligence is a construct. Inclusion, feelings of inclusion, a student agency. How much does a student individually feel as if their own decisions and their own efforts are valued and valued to them? So those are some interesting constructs, and you're going to be looking at more of those as the semester progresses. Now, let me just say a quick word then. Those are the notes. You'll be investigating and reviewing those and applying those in some of the assignments for this week. And let me just review with you the assignments. First of all, I already mentioned that reading through the course notes for week 2 is an important part of the week. You're also assigned quite a bit of reading from the Understanding How We Learn book. I hope you found those readings really interesting, and I hope you find the book an interesting way to present information. So even though there are 5 chapters that are assigned for this week, in that text or in that book, that's not a tremendous amount of reading. It is a lot of information because there's a lot of information and ideas that are packed into those pages that are very effectively illustrated. But those readings address misconceptions about teaching and learning and foundational principles of learning. Some of the foundations, and there's a chapter on each, have to do with attention, perception, and memory. Those three are foundational principles that really it's worth revisiting those fundamental ideas as educators, because everything we do as educators in many ways is dependent or rests on top of number 1, attention. Nobody's going to learn much of anything if they're not attending to it. And perception and how people perceive things differently, and also how the decisions we can make as educators can help promote common perceptions. And then, of course, memory and how memory works and what we can do to help facilitate information that we want students to have as part of their memory so that it can be applied in important ways. All of that is really, really important. And then you have some, in addition to the reflections over the understanding how we learn text, you also have a reflection on scientific literacy, and I want to finish this little introduction with that. I'm going to skip that one for now. Reflection number 7, you have a reading from Daniel Willingham on how to trust or when to trust the experts. And that all ties together some of the really fundamental ideas about what does it mean to apply scientific thinking in the real world, and trusting experts is all part of that. And the project for this week, you have one project, and it addresses your own doing a little bit of research online in terms of literature research to identify misconceptions about teaching and learning that are common. So it's going to further the examples that are provided in the text that you're reading are very specific, but there are broad categories of common misconceptions, and I'm going to have you do some research on that. Identify a misconception that you may or may not have had in your life or in your job as either a student or a teacher. And then you're going to go further with a literature review to try to identify why is it a misconception? What data do we have to suggest that it is an erroneous idea or belief? And you're just going to summarize all of that. And what you're going to try to do is summarize it in a single page. I'm hopeful that you can. So that's what the project is. And I want to end by saying that one of the reflections for this week, you're going to read this very short, kind of an editorial article from an online magazine called The Big Think, and it has to do with science literacy. And one of the things one of the conclusions that is made is not made kind of directly in the article, but it's an important idea, and that is the premise is that we may have the wrong idea about what being scientifically literate means, what scientific literacy really is, and so the reason why that's such an important thing to consider is because it's foundational to the most important role that any educator has, the most important role that you have and that I have, and that any teacher has. And it's not to keep the students safe or to organize information in a certain way. It's not even to help ensure that students learn what the state wants them to learn and will measure. That's important. Those are important parts of the job, but they're not the job. They're not the foundation of the job. And our foundation as educators is to make really good decisions about what is important to be learned, and then to help facilitate the learning of those important things in our classroom. So when I was a science teacher, I could have some standards or content-related outcomes that were very important for my students to learn. But more importantly, by far, would be that my students I would promote sound scientific reasoning skills in my class, regardless of whether or not those were going to be measured on any external exam that I was going to be held accountable for as an educator. That I don't care. I mean, those are important, but my goal foremost is to decide what's important, and all of us have that job. to do. You know, anti-racism is a really important thing for teachers to be teaching now at all grade levels. Teaching respect for person, teaching good collaboration skills, teaching good communication skills, conflict resolution skills, media literacy. You know, there's never going to be, there probably won't be in our lifetime, standardized tests that measure some of those important things. And yet it's become very apparent in our world that people aren't learning those things as much as they should. And it's our job to make sure that they do. So that's my sermon for week 2 of this class. This class focuses on science and scientific thinking and scientific reasoning under the overall header of educational research. And I hope that by the end of these 7 weeks, if nothing else, those are some of the skills that you have continued to refine in your life as a teacher and in your life as a human being. So hope you enjoy week 2.